Thank you, Madam Chair. I speak in support of adopting Ranking Member Luetkemeier's resolution of inquiry. I support my colleague's amendment. Secretary Yellen has a responsibility to come in front of this committee. Her testimony was not optional, but in fact mandated by the CARES Act. As members of this committee know, President Trump's Treasury Secretary came in front of the Small Business Committee in 2020. He followed his statutory obligation. There's no reason that Secretary Yellen should not be here to do exactly the same thing. In addition to questions about the Paycheck Protection Program, I have a number of questions about President Biden's policies. It would be helpful if Secretary Yellen would address them. For example, Secretary Yellen said Biden's so-called Inflation Reduction Act would, quote, usher in the next phase of America's future, end quote. If Secretary Yellen were to testify in front of this committee, I'd love to know what she believes this next phase of America's future looks like. I hear from my constituents every single day that President Biden's spending bill is a disaster and will raise energy costs, it will raise taxes, and ultimately spend billions of federal dollars for wasteful government programs that our children and grandchildren will be saddled with for years to come. Just yesterday, in the ranking member's office, received data about where small businesses are, what small businesses are thinking, and they are very pessimistic about our future. If you look at the latest numbers, Americans are spending down their cash, deposits in banks are going down, and loans are going up. Surely this is not the future that Secretary Yellen would envision, and without her testimony, we simply don't know what her vision is. Staying on subject of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, let's talk about the bill's enormous expansion of the IRS. This has small business owners across the nation concerned that they're going to be targeted by an out-of-control, weaponized Department of Treasury. Last Thursday, Secretary Yellen touted the $80 billion in funding for the IRS by claiming that the money would go towards getting constituents' questions answered more quickly. I have heard from constituents, small businesses in my district about their frustration with the IRS. And yes, they do want their questions answered. However, the reality is the IRS provision within the IRA was included as a pay-for. The IRS funding is expected to raise $240 billion in additional revenue for the bill to finance other Biden admin policies. That's why the Biden administration wanted to include it in the bill. If Secretary Yellen were here, I'd love to ask why the bill couldn't have spent maybe a half, a quarter, or even a tenth of the amount on the IRS, or kept its funding strictly focused on customer service rather than using it to audit and harass the American people. I would also love to hear from Secretary Yellen on the issue of inflation. Small businesses consistently rank inflation as one of their top concerns in surveys. Secretary Yellen called inflation, quote-unquote, transitory, until finally admitting she was wrong about the inflation crisis in comments to Wolf Blitzer in a CNN interview in June of this year. Now that Secretary Yellen has finally recognized the reality that inflation is a serious problem that cannot be wished away, I would love to hear what she plans to do about it. If Secretary Yellen testified in front of this committee, I'd like to ask her what the administration is going to do about inflation, the very same inflation that is crushing Americans and small business. The small businesses of Nebraska would benefit from some clarity from the Secretary on how the Biden administration plans to get us out of this mess that it's made of its own creation. I know they are not alone. The American people deserve answers from the Treasury Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.